Hello, everybody. Just want to make sure that you can all see and hear.
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. So I am Dr. Larissa Werniak, and I want to thank you all for coming to our third and final installment of the American Studies Film Festival. We, of course, have had a double billing this afternoon into evening of Miracle and Red Army. And now we will be joined for a discussion of the films by Dr. Jennifer Hudson and Dr. Neil Pogue. So just want to welcome them, both faculty members in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies, teaching significantly in the American Studies program. And I want to open the conversation just by asking each of them if they have opening thoughts. I think that, of course, there's so much material for us to consider here, particularly when we're juxtaposing these two films, that we will probably be suffering from an overabundance of ideas as opposed to a dearth. So many, many directions in which we'll be able to go in exploring these texts. So Jennifer, would you like to lead off?
Absolutely. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. So there are so many things, as Larissa said, to unpack these two films and different symbolisms and ideas that we can draw from them. So I'm going to try to be as succinct as I can here for a couple of key points that I found with their similarities and their differences. And one of them that stood out to me is the difference between how Miracle and Red Army showcases identity within both countries during the Cold War. In Miracle, you have the players really trying to move past being individual players and playing kind of from their Minnesota or Boston teams, as many of them were from, and turning more into a cohesive collective unit playing for the United States of America in the 1980 Olympics. And then in Red Army, you see kind of the opposite almost effect in terms of identity. You have a very collective unit working together very cohesively in the beginning, and then in the aftermath of the game, kind of having that disillusion of cohesiveness and collectivity and kind of focusing a little bit more on individuality and trying to find their own way, which is in essence also very symbolic about the Soviet Union in the 1980s and that tumultuous decade for them, trying to figure out their way through perestroika and glasnost and up to the dissolution in 1991. So that's one of the main things that I see very significant in the two films.
Great. Yeah, I think that that is absolutely a topic we can consider further, kind of these ideas of how we find a balance in sports and national identity between the individual, the collective, what we emphasize both in kind of a reality and in the telling. So I think there's really a lot there to continue to explore. Neil, I'll turn to you for opening thoughts.
Okay. Well, I guess everyone can see me or can hear me, right?
We can hear you.
Yes, we can hear you.
You can't see me though.
No,
yet.
you are a schematic circle.
Well, my camera is supposed. Anyway, I'll just get going, but my camera says it's on. Anyway, the things that really stood out to me, at least the first thing that really stood out to me about these two films is they're very similar with the idea of the sort of the David and Goliath story. You have Red Army starting out with, well, Russia has been destroyed from World War II. They showed, horrible pictures of destroyed cities. And it was mentioned that over 20 million Russians were killed during the war. So it was a rebuild, and it was a rebuild back to strength. And so that's what the national hockey team really meant. And you have the same exact same thing going on in the U.S., where, usually, and this is kind of like the interesting thing about U.S. movies is a lot of the films are always the underdog, the Mighty Ducks, or A New Hope. The Jedi, they're about all dead, but they're going to come back. They're a ragtag group. Well, although the U.S. has all these resources and it's one of the richest nations in the world, we're kind of set up again as a ragtag group of nobody's a professional, and they really hit you in the face with that as soon as the movie started, that this was amateurs. and the NHL players are getting destroyed, and how can this team have any chance? So they're also portrayed in that way. And at the same time, at least with Miracle, the Russian team or the Soviet team is seen as kind of machines. They, it's mentioned like, do they ever smile? Like, no, if they smile, they'd go to prison. So there's, and same thing with the Russian coach. He doesn't say anything. He's just stone-faced during the whole final Olympic game until at the very end he starts losing it and shouting and stuff. So there's sort of like that really cool, I don't know, I would say cliche David and Goliath type feel, but people love that stuff. So that's there. The other thing that really struck me was the patriotism aspect of it. Like with Miracle, I kept waiting to see, well, where is the American patriotism going to hit? Well, it doesn't hit until they're doing sprints back and forth, and that's when they find their team identity. And Kurt Russell says, "Okay, now it's time to go home," because one of the players says, "I'm on Team America or Team USA." And the only other time we really see patriotism or U.S. patriotism is when we finally get to the Olympics itself. And I was sort of interested, why keep it so quiet? It could have to do with the time period that it was actually released in, which was during the Iraq War. And Disney, of course, probably wants to make money worldwide, so they wanted to keep it quiet. And you could even go back to during the Iraq War with something like Superman Returns. Superman was always truth, justice, and in the American way. Well, when they're talking about Superman in that film, they don't say the American way. They just say truth, justice, and all that stuff. So it's kind of interesting when films, books, anything, when they're released, they also are thinking about, well, how do I maximize my profits? How do I not lose my audience? And so those are at least just two things that kind of struck me the most out of anything.
Yeah, and I think, Neil, that your comments, as well as some of the things that Jennifer was saying, really provide a good segue into the question that Dr. Nakvi is asking in the comments. He said, "It's striking to me that Miracle chose not to include Brooks, stating that the U.S. win proved the superiority of the American economic and political system. I wonder the panelists' thoughts on why the film would downplay his willingness to be a Cold Warrior this way." And I think this is really interesting. For me, this is resonating with some of the narrative in the aftermath of George H.W. Bush's death, where some of the aspects of his background as a Cold Warrior were really kind of downplayed or minimized for a different age. I think too, I really hadn't been thinking as much about, of course, those vital issues of production and moment of release that Neil brought up in terms of the Iraq War, American prestige or lack thereof internationally, and then of course Disney's profit motive. So I think that would be a great question to move to think about the actuality and then the depiction of that kind of that intersection between sports and politics in the two films and the two systems.
Well, you go ahead and begin, Jennifer, and I'll.
All right, perfect. Well, there's so many different directions that we could go with the question that you're posing, and also with what Kaz is posing, both of which I think are really valid constructs to kind of try to analyze these two films and make sense of, one, Miracle being more of a kind of Disney-esque film, so it has a little bit more of a modus operandi in terms of how they're going to depict things, and of course we have that kind of typical crescendo and swelling of music and emotionality as the film progresses to the victory of the U.S. in the Olympic game. Not to discount the emotionality of the actual win in real life in the United States, and certainly kind of solidifying, well, if the Cold War is an ideological conflict, not a military one, in terms of turning the Cold War hot, proverbially, this could serve as a proverbial or literal win, depending on your views of the Cold War, that we won on the ice, we won during the Cold War, and we kind of beat the Soviet style of game, in essence, in its own right. And then in terms of Red Army, kind of focusing not so much on the build up to the Olympic game, but more focusing kind of on the aftermath of that. And I think with Fetisov really being the central figure that's interviewed in the documentary Red Army, really showcasing of, okay, if we think the Soviet style and, you know, our economic system, our political system, our economic system is superior to the West and specifically to the United States, we kind of see this a little bit in kind of his glib or a little bit of disdain towards the director, especially in the opening and closing scenes of, you Americans don't understand the value of hard work, and here I am trying to work, and kind of pulling out his phone and carrying on a phone conversation in the middle of being interviewed for a documentary, which I find amusing as well. But to then have that, if as a Soviet thinking our Soviet system is superior, and then the United States beats us in that system, what does that then mean internally and on a grander geopolitical scale? What does this mean in our kind of placement in world affairs during the Cold War, and having to deal with that loss and really trying to figure out, where do we go from here? If we can't really be Cold War warriors anymore, we've got to find a different route to take, so to speak. And then another point that Kaz mentioned in the question, I think it's interesting that Herb Brooks really tries to develop a hybrid system, that he's going to kind of combine the North American style with the Canada style, and combine elements of Soviet training and conditioning to an extent for his own players, and how we can kind of draw the larger implications of that, of trying to figure out sort of peaceful coexistence between the East and the West. Where can we find a happy medium between the two, and figure out how we can celebrate our similarities without necessarily dwelling so much on the differences, if that makes sense.
Right. No, I think those are really good points. You know, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the fact that we're never able to see our own propaganda as propaganda. To us, it's our story, it's our national identity, it's our character. These things, you know, they seem so real to us, and yet when we analyze or evaluate somebody else's, it seems so obviously false, such a facade. You know, and I'm always fascinated in the way that we try to make the way that we sport, the way that we do sports, represent or say something about our national character, that we play hockey in a way that demonstrates our freedom and our individualism, and so forth, you know. And what I was kind of thinking is there would be a way to almost flip these narratives. You know, there were aspects of Brooks that were so authoritarian and so rigid and so demanding, you know, and I think that I really note this as somebody who grew up training intensively in a fairly brutal sport in competitive swimming that involved cold pools at 5 a.m. and things like that. You know, a lot of yelling, and then I would watch the Olympics and people would be like, she just swims with so much freedom, you know what I mean? Something like that. You know, the way that we kind of read those narratives, those elements of character and myth making into the athletic performances, I think are really important, really interesting. Yeah. Neil, did you want to?
Yeah, I was just going to come through and just say, you know, these points are great, and I really like the point about Brooks being this authoritarian. He's basically kind of making machines, but we don't see the players actually turn into them. They're worked really hard. At least the teams that I've been on, where the coach is all into conditioning, the team doesn't do well. But in these two cases, it actually works out. So, and this kind of also goes back to like a film, if you've seen it, you know, Rocky IV, where Rocky's out, you know, conditioning, and they have the music montage of him like working out, whereas Drago is in this state-of-the-art facility getting ready. So you have someone who doesn't have much in the way of funds go up against someone who's state-sponsored, like the Russian boxer. And this actually goes back to, you know, with something like Rocky IV, is exactly what Brooks is talking about, who he was quoted there in Red Army, where he says, our way of life will continue. This shows that America's great and all that kind of stuff. And one of the things that they really highlighted throughout both of these films is history, chronological history of both countries. And the one thing that really stood out to me, at least with Miracle, is they quoted or had Jimmy Carter's Crisis of Confidence speech, which he gave in '79. Now, that speech, I mean, I personally would argue, kind of got him a one-term presidency, because Reagan was hitting him hard, saying we don't have a crisis of confidence. Even 4 years later, in his commercials, he's saying it's morning in America again. He says we don't have malaise in our society. We get up every morning. It is morning here. And so we have this idea of the answer that the gold medal, or what gave the answer that the United States got from winning that gold medal, was an answer to Carter's speech, in which he says, we don't look to the future anymore. We're failing. What we need to do is work harder, and we can get it. And that's kind of what the film is trying to symbolize, at least with that aspect. And just to kind of piggyback off of what we were also talking about when it comes to being patriotic, is we also have to remember that Festivoff, he is still a politician when this documentary is made. So towards the end, Polsky asked him, he says, well, if you don't like what's going on in Russia right now, would you want to go back to Soviet Russia? And the response is kind of jumping around, but he basically says, I'm a politician now. And so we have to also put that into perspective of, he's looking out for himself in the future, and he's being interviewed about something that happened quite a while ago. And when I found that in my own research, when I interview someone that was a part of something really important 20 years ago, their story is set up for the immediate, present. They're not going to really tell you what happened unless they know the consequences are going to be nil. So that's just something else that just came to mind.
Right. I think that's such a good point, and such an American studies point, such an apt American studies point, to be saying that, we can look at these texts and we can make a very plausible argument that they're telling us a lot more about 2014 than they're telling us about 1980 or 1984, right? And I think that is really part of the richness of these historical texts. I think it really is part of why people are drawn to them, especially now that we're 7 years removed from the making of the film itself, kind of doubling back that way. But I think that is really worthwhile, when we do this kind of historical work and we're looking for interpretations, when we're trying to make arguments, thinking about the meaning of these events as, of course, not being static, that they're shaped so much by what happens afterwards. I was thinking about, for example, the Summer Olympic boycotts, of course, that came after, in kind of interspersed between the American gold medals in '80 and then the Soviet gold medals in '84 and '88. The ways that you could think of these two economies as being really on different trajectories as the Soviet Union really starts to struggle. And, the ways that, regardless of what was happening in the moment, that this is shaping the ways that we understand, that we see, the American victory as a jumping off point for Morning in America, for sort of this, new understanding of Americanism and so forth. So, yeah, I think that's such a great point, Neil.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it's important for us to remember, you brought up the significance of propaganda and kind of seeing a little bit more of the Russian propaganda side of things. We're not necessarily as attuned with our own propaganda because that's more often projected to more of an international front as opposed to on the domestic stage. Mm-hmm. But propaganda is, of course, all about perception management. So we have to kind of keep in mind some of the commentary that they bring up in Miracle, for instance, when they're watching some of the Soviet films of the Soviet players of, well, of course, he's not going to let a puck go through the goal because then his family is going to be shot and so forth. And then in Red Army, we have Fetisov's wife mention about how they did try to inflict psychological and physical harm to Fetisov when he was kind of rebelling against the Soviet mentality, that there was still kind of the overriding issue through the Cold War is, of course, issues of fear and concerns about not only the present, but the future. We're both superpowers at this point in time. We have more of a kind of multi country status, of course, now in the 21st century than we really did during the Cold War time period. But I think you see in both of the films how propaganda has really disseminated into different aspects of society and culture, including athletics and sports. And I think as the Cold War progressed, and I think the two films we watched today really showcase this, culture becomes increasingly more politicized in both countries, and then politics also becomes increasingly acculturated. And I think that we see that in how, at least in the kind of microcosms that we saw today in both countries, that as well.
I was sort of fascinated when it comes to how a country is portrayed when Russia was basically kind of, at least the way it was portrayed in Red Army, is Russia was kind of forced into allowing their players to come play for the NHL, and then they would take their salaries. And it really, I guess at that time, it was the best thing they could get out of a dire situation. Because they initially did not want their players to go to the NHL. They wanted to hold on to them, but they would defect. And the other thing that kind of that was of interest to me in Red Army, of the only way it seemed that Russian players would want to play in the United States is through the temptation of money, through the temptation of material goods. Like, this is the only thing that America has that makes us attractive, and that's the only thing that would make him come over. And that also made me think of another, as I've already discussed with Carter's speech, the part of Carter's The Malaise of Society or Crisis of Confidence speech that wasn't highlighted, I was sort of waiting for this to come out, is the problem that he found with America back in 1979 wasn't that we necessarily didn't want to work hard. He said very many or several times in the middle of his speech that we are a slave to things. We think that by making money and buying things that he says this will not satisfy. We have to look beyond this material world. But of course, when Reagan becomes president, it all was about the economy. I mean, and this kind of asks us to sort of question ourselves as to, is this all America is? Are we a one issue country that we're just focused on money, and this is all we have to offer? Well, the Russian players, they were only coming over for the nice house, the nice car, the $1 million paycheck. So anyway, that was, when it comes to how a country is portrayed, Russia at that time was in dire straits. People didn't have much, and so they were leaving so they could possibly get some money out of the NHL. But at the same time, it also portrays the United States as not all that great if all we are is a place that can offer people money.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that comes into particularly sharp relief in this film, because the reason the NHL is the premier professional hockey league in the world is because of money, right? This is a different situation as opposed to the NBA, the NFL, baseball, where in part there might be the draw of, I want to go play in this league because that is where the best players in the world play, right? You see that with the NBA, certainly, that people are actively excited about that. But, the hockey culture in the United States in particular, of course, as I think is made very clear, this is not the hockey culture that you have dreamed of, right? and so I think with some of that removed, we see the way that the money itself is such an incentive. And I think it's a really stark contrast when we look on the one hand, the willingness of the players to defect, the fear of the state about that, but also the fact that these players now today, that they are so connected, that they are so loyal in a way that has superseded the nation state, that they are back there like to a successor state involved in the government. It just really seems like a stark contrast with the fear that, like, oh, if we don't take their salaries, like we'll never see these guys again.
Right. And to kind of piggyback a little bit about what you're talking about. And I think that, yes, they were drawn certainly to come to the United States to play for the money, for the economic and financial security that they weren't finding at this time in their home country, as Neil has pointed out as well. But then when they come and actually start playing for us in the NHL, they realize this isn't the hockey that I thought it was. This isn't the experience I was anticipating. And they kind of have that sense of loss and trying to figure out, is this really what I came here for? Is there really something more substantive that I can come out of this experience? Or is it just going to push me more, as it eventually did with Fetisov, to return back to his home country and figure out a way to kind of help revitalize the hockey culture within what would become the Russian Federation as opposed to the Soviet Union. So,
yeah, that's really interesting. All these players, I would say, I guess I would have to say just about all of them, return back to Russia, which is kind of fascinating because when they come to the United States, as Jennifer just mentioned, it's not a great system where they're winning. All of a sudden they're starting to lose, and NHL sports announcers are saying, they don't really look like they're on their game. Something's up. But it's only when the Detroit Red Wings gets all 5 players working for them, they start winning. Well, this all of a sudden, they're winning. And not only that, what's interesting is when they first come over, nobody wants them. But when they start winning, and this is several years after the end of the Soviet Union, like they interviewed that one fan, and he says, well, they're Russian players, but they're on our team, and we're winning with them. And therefore, all of a sudden, they start being accepted as a part of, to represent the city. And that's really important. And if they're starting to be accepted as part of the community, did that actually translate beyond the hockey rink? They never answer that, but that's kind of an interesting thing to think about, because if they consider themselves a part of the American community, you would think at least some people would stay, but most go back and work for, or find work back in Russia. It's possible that they never really saw themselves as Americans eventually.
Yeah. And I will say those players are certainly still perceived as heroes in Detroit. They are very much perceived as part of the fabric of the city, and I guess what I was thinking about too, Neil, is kind of a related question. If you don't feel like you are part of the community, if you don't feel like you have an opportunity to integrate, and you're far from home. I grew up a Pittsburgh Penguins fan, so of course I have many feelings about the Detroit Red Wings. But I was always thinking, I found it so interesting that for many years after Sidney Crosby came into the league, he lived with Mario Lemieux and his family. And people teased him about it, and he was like, "I don't want to live by myself. I don't want a life where I go to hockey practice and come home to like my sad, like, lonely apartment." And like he was sort of like, "I like Mario's kids. I like having a family around." It was such an unusual thing for a hockey player, a sports star to say, but it really did make me think just about the isolation that any athlete can experience, coming into an American individualistic kind of compartmentalized culture, not fitting into the community. I mean, I can't imagine, kind of from a mental health perspective, what that adjustment, what that culture shock would have actually been like. Yeah.
Well, I think we could even connect it with these COVID times. I was listening to NPR today, and they were talking about, well, if cases are spiking and we're supposed to stay home, and more Americans, almost more than ever, there's a lot more today of people who live alone. What do you do? Especially because jobs take people a long ways away from their families. And as you just mentioned, culture from New England is a lot different than Texas, than California or Florida. How do you cope? And And that's something that certainly people who live not only by themselves but a long way from home have to struggle with. And
Yeah.
going far beyond professional hockey players, that the common American today is certainly struggling with that,
Right.
especially as we move into the holidays.
I think
Right.
something else to note. I think something else to note from the movie is that how regimented the hockey coach for the Russian team, how regimented he had them practicing. They were, I mean, 11 months a year. They went home for 36 nights. I think that's what the one of the mothers said. And so they were basically sequestered, And so when one of them was hired to go to the US teams and didn't have that structure, he fell apart. And I found that very, very interesting because just alone, you think of Russia as this very industrialized place. You think of it as like the cogs turning and things like that. And this individual didn't have that machine-like structure in his life anymore. And suddenly he kind of, just kind of fell apart and was lost and ended up going back. And it seemed to take a really big effect on him. Whereas the other player, like you guys were talking about, went, lived in a home with a family. And obviously the transition seemed to be a little easier, I feel like. So I just found that contrast to be interesting.
Yeah, I think so. So I think Ramin has an interesting question in the comments, saying that she found it ironic that they had such a hard time finding a team in the U.S. because they were such stars. I'm wondering, just to parse to what extent this is a public relations decision, a cultural concern about, things like integration, style of play, and so forth. I'm not sure how much we want to speculate, but it does seem like an interesting question of what would have led to that situation.
I think it was very multi-pronged in terms of why they had such a hard time finding a kind of transplanted, a new home, if you will, here in the United States with new teams. I think certainly economics plays a factor into this in terms of they knew that they would have to pay out so much more to get their contracts from the Army and from the military, from the police bureau and so forth, to have to pay more for talent that they were noticing as more of the Russians were being transitioned into the NHL. They're having a very hard time adjusting to the American style way of hockey. And it kind of makes me think a little bit of a 1970s film Slapshot, of this kind of old time hockey of it's about fighting more so than it is the skill and just the beauty and the kind of poetic motion of the style that the Soviets were used to. And as Neil mentioned earlier, it really wasn't until they got the Russian Five to work cohesively as a unit were they then successful and could start getting wins for the Detroit Red Wings, which again is another layer of symbolism in itself that they played for the Red Wings, which I absolutely find wonderful. And this fact that one of the coaches that they interview for the Detroit Red Wings comments of, I don't know what it is you all are doing. I'm not necessarily going to try to figure out the style that you're doing. Just keep doing it. Don't change anything. Whereas Herb Brooks was realizing we need to be cognizant of when our style isn't working and adapt to the times and incorporate more of a hybrid style of play. So I think both coaches, yes, were certainly very hard line, I guess would be a conciliatory way of putting it, with their coaching styles. But at the same point, I think Tikhonov we could maybe construe as a little bit more of a hardline approach as opposed to Herb Brooks, in the sense of, as Fetisov says, I respected him as a coach, but I did not respect him as an individual. And we see a little bit of that with Herb Brooks as well, with the film, that they respected him as the coach. But I find it interesting that they referred to him by his first name as opposed to just Coach or Coach Brooks or something. So there is that layer of personable kind of personalities between the two coaches that I think was also maybe a little startling for the Soviet players coming over to have to adjust to maybe having a little bit more freedom and not having somebody being so much of an overseer with what they were being expected to do all the time. So
And just to add on to that, to answer the question, I think it's possible that NHL coaches knew what they wanted from the players. Sort of like how Herb Brooks, he came up with his whole roster, on the first day. He knew how all the cogs were going to fit together to make the engine run. Well, NHL coaches, they possibly knew how this new player could add to their team, but at least the way the Red Army portrayed it, there was so much hatred among the players themselves that maybe players on the team didn't want to play with that player, and so they're basically sabotaging the person. That's certainly possible. And not only that, but it seems that, or at least the way it was portrayed, more fights actually broke out, which ruined the style of play. I would have to talk to someone that really knew. Well, I watched hockey in the 1990s, but I wasn't a fanatic. But I would like to compare the amount of fights on the ice versus the 10 years later to see if, well, maybe the game started to mature into more of a fluid art rather than having enforcers go out, as Jennifer just said, a slap shot, people beating each other up. So it's possible that coaches knew where these people are going to fit in, but it didn't work out because of the dislike.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good argument, and I have seen evidence about the vast diminishment of fighting in hockey over the last 30 years in the NHL. And of course, fighting always played a much diminished role in non-NHL hockey, on the larger Olympic-sized rink, in the non-American style of play. So looking at that give and take, I mean, that's a really interesting cultural give and take, right? About how, the league may have shaped the players may have shaped the league. As the NHL is getting in so many more players not from North America, how does that change, the style of play, the approach to the game, things like that? I think that making that argument is probably fairly plausible, since there is such a critical mass of in-migration in that way.
Well, even if we think about in Miracle, when the team starts working together is after the fight. You get like that, like the two players, they hate each other because one's apparently ruined the other guy's chance to win the championship, and so Brooks lets them fight it out. And once they're done fighting it out, he tries to bring the team together. So yeah, and that is what Brooks was all about, is making the team, is making people actually work together. And if you don't have that, you don't have a team at all. And that is what makes a great coach, is making everybody do their job. Bill Belichick, of course. So this is, and that's so it is possible that if the team never accepts a player, then they're useless, and that's why Brooks made sure everybody did work together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I found it interesting that it took so long, at least in how the filmic rendition of it plays out in Miracle, that it took so long for one of the players to finally realize, when he asked, who do you play for, to finally say the United States of America as opposed to the University of Wisconsin or so forth.
Yeah.
And it's
that's why I was like, where's the USA? Where's the patriotism? It's not there.
Exactly. It takes them so long, and then it's sort of like, okay, finally you get it. Now we can stop doing these drills, which the players refer to as doing the herbies. Let's stop doing the herbies, and now we can actually get down to playing hockey and getting towards the end goal, which is not just to get to a medal game, but also ideally to beat the Soviet Union, that we see in the very first scene of the movie of, yes, we want to get to the medal games, but my goal is also ultimately to beat the Soviet Union. And here's how I think we need to pattern ourselves so that we can have both of those victories.
But was Brooks doing it really for the United States, or was he doing it for himself? I sort of saw it as a white whale, crusade. And that's why, like, his wife is like, well, are you going to pick up the kid? And he's like, no, I have to do this. But if you're not by my side, of course, it doesn't mean anything. I was like, where are the women in this film? It's just his wife, Patty, and she's expected just to toe the line and put up with it because he is he's after Moby Dick. He needs that win.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that's a good point you bring up, Neil, is the interplay of families and wives and children portrayed in both of the films. That Miracle, we see much more concertedly in terms of Jim Craig and his father with his mother passing, that kind of internal struggle, but also I'm trying to win this as an homage for my mother because this is what she wanted to achieve for me when she was driving me back and forth to practices as a kid. So you have a little bit more of an interplay in terms of gender relationships and family relationships, and that how his struggle really bleeds into the family struggles. And then Red Army, we have a little bit of a glimpse with it, with Fetisov's wife, for instance, being interviewed about some of the trials and tribulations that the family faced when they were rebelling against the government. But we don't get that nearly as much, I don't think, in Miracle. And we could extrapolate in terms of what that means about ideological differences and how the two different films were really trying to showcase the two perspectives. But I thought that was a good observation, Neil. So
I agree. And I think something that's thrown into particularly sharp relief right now, given, for example, the NBA bubble, right, and the strain that that puts on families, I think really depicting in ways that people don't necessarily consider what it is actually like to be a professional athlete, and the way that, even though of course you may be privileged in certain ways tremendously, that the strain that that exerts is real. You know, I did notice, I thought it was significant this season that some athletes were talking about that, and that some athletes were talking about the mental health ramifications of the stress of this, of dealing with these situations, and the strains not just on them but on their families. Something that I think is really often kind of undercover, that we as fans don't hear a lot about. So I think a real connection there to a very contemporary problem.
mm-hmm.
Or we could talk about graduate school.
You know, and of course that's the kind of parallel, you know, I was thinking about, and as you guys were saying earlier, kind of have been talking about a lot recently, the sports example, the university example of, in American society, the expectation that you will pick up and go wherever, probably multiple times, moving to places where you know nobody and have no support network. And you know, that even though we do not have like walkout music and are not superstars in the same way, that is something that like I think is very real for all of us, and is real for so many people who are trying to fulfill career goals, dreams, you know, coming from smaller places in America, and the challenge that presents culturally in terms of not feeling like you have that backup in any way, that it is really hard. And I think that it's something that is often the effects of that are understated or underappreciated, maybe.
Yeah, I think everybody thinks, or not everyone, but a lot of people think that professional athletes, because they're getting paid so much, it doesn't really matter. But not everybody makes, you know, that much money. Which goes back to sort of like the process of how a professional athlete is built. The people who we were watching in the Red Army were the best of the best. We don't really know how many other thousands of people were a part of that process when they finally whittled it down to just a couple. And the same thing goes on with our system. There's we can just look at, for example, figure skating or gymnastics. That lifestyle is so hard on so many people for just a couple of spots. I'm blanking out on the swimmer. Who's the most famous swimmer? The 7 gold medalist.
Michael Phelps.
Yes, Michael Phelps. He's actually pushing a program for the mental health of Olympians, because he knows that they have been working nonstop for that one spot. And he's like, well, what are they going to do after the Olympics is over? That's something that we need to think about. Well, we should also be thinking about the thousands of other people who've really gone for broke to get that position. And that's, you know, like at the very end of, like, we know what happens to the players from the Red Army, it seems like everybody has landed on their feet, at least the couple that we got to know. Whereas in Miracle, I was surprised that I didn't, at the very end when they said what the different players were doing, I didn't see, so-and-so spent, 10 years playing for the Boston Bruins. Everybody had to find their own way after such a highlight in their life. And I sort of wonder how they were sort of like dealt with that. Like, was that the pinnacle, or were they able to find other things to sort of fight for and be interested in afterwards? I'm sure, but after such a high of the Olympics, not just for the 1980 team, but any Olympian, that's something that Michael Phelps is trying to address in the present day.
Yeah. Suzanne, they mentioned in the movie, change to the Dream Team and the NHL allowing, so like with the NBA, of course, now allowing for the professional hockey players to participate in the Olympics. So right now, I believe that the NHL kind of makes a decision as to whether they're going to participate. And I believe they didn't. They did not during the last Winter Olympics. Is that correct? Because they didn't want to take a lengthy break from their schedule when it was in South Korea. But in general, yeah. Any thoughts about that? Kind of how this has changed the Olympics, the kind of the associations, the nationalistic associations surrounding some of the team sports, and so forth in terms of amateurism and professionalism.
Neil, do you want to take that one first? You've been letting me go first this whole time. You need to go first too.
Okay, well, I'll go first. No, I found that interesting where Brooks at the very end of the film Miracle is saying like, okay, well, there's professional athletes now, but it's not so much a dream team, is it? Because the dream team is doing something amazing like the 1980 squad did, and it, to a certain extent, I guess it does take the romanticism out of the game. But then you could go back to the dream team with Michael Jordan and Larry Bird, and that's like, wow, this is crazy. How is this possible? So I could see like how it certainly brings in a lot of interest. All of a sudden, for one time, you get to see the best players in the world work with each other on the same team, and that's extremely exciting. I'm sure the Olympic Committee likes that because it certainly brings a lot more people in to watch the games. But at the same time, as Brooks says, it sort of takes the romanticism out, and I doubt they would have made the movie Miracle and named it Miracle if it did not happen, or if it happened with professional players. And the other thing is what Brooks mentioned, that when it comes to professional players, you may have the strongest players, but if they just don't work together, you're still going to lose anyway.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think there is something that makes it extra emotional and romantic, as you said, Neil, about having college athletes play on a global scale for the country. I know, as kind of a personal aside, I really enjoy watching college sports more so than professional sports, just because I find that there's a greater sense of urgency and passion and skill for the game. Whereas more in professional athletes, it's a little bit more in terms of a little bit more about individuality and kind of posing and making sure that they get the points, as opposed to playing more as a collective team that Brooks was trying to convey to his own team of, we're playing for the United States, as opposed to your individual colleges and so forth. But at the same point, as you said, Neil, professional athletes certainly have much more name recognition. So that plays into, we're going to fill the stadiums more because people want to come and see how all of these all-stars on very disparate teams play together to form, hopefully, a very triumphant team for the US to win on a global stage. But at the same point, that plays into finances and commercialism, and it's a business and bureaucracy and so forth as well, of we're trying to get as many fans interested in watching it via the television, or coming and traveling and watching it in person. So there's that kind of commercial aspect to it as well.
Yeah, and we could look at the Baseball World Classic and that is professional players playing on Team America against other countries. There is the real concern that a pitcher may blow his arm out in a game that's not his team. And what's kind of amazing to me is that's basically like World Cup soccer, except with baseball. But there is no interest. And this is one time where you see the all-stars playing against other countries, and there's no interest here in the US. Like barely anybody watches it. Or we could look at the NFL Pro Bowl, and people make fun of them all the time. They're like, oh, they're just doing like 25% effort, that sort of thing. So you can, I guess, have the all-star of the all-star teams, but it doesn't, I guess, always bring in viewers. I guess it just depends on the sport and the event.
Yeah.
So.
Good. Well, I think that we are coming to the end of our time, and that is probably a good place to leave things. I want to thank Jennifer and Neil for participating in such a great conversation. I really enjoyed this. I thought this was so much fun to be able to watch these films together and to comment. And I want to thank everybody for coming, for participating, and also for really, really great questions and comments in the chat all the way through the films. I really loved the level of interaction that we had today to really feel like this was something akin to a communal experience, even though that
Absolutely.
right now. So thank you guys so much. This was really, really wonderful. And I wish all of you a really great end of the semester, and stay tuned for more exciting American Studies events in the spring and maybe some more films next fall. So thanks again, guys, and have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you as well for organizing this and moderating this. I love the interaction that we had too. So thank you all for a really wonderful afternoon, early evening.
Right.
And Dante and Aurora, of course, are the true champions. They put in an enormous amount of work, and I am super grateful to them. We could not have even remotely done this without all of their efforts.
Thank you so much.
A very heartfelt thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You guys have a great night.
Too.
You too.
Thanks. Bye-bye.